Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. April is National Poetry Month, and we are celebrating the works of award-winning poet Crystal Simone Smith, who writes poetry about the human condition and social change. Her new book, Dark Testament, is an extraordinary collection of poems giving voice to the mournful dead, their lives unjustly lost to violence, and the grieving chorus of protesters in today's Black Lives Matter movement and in search of resilience and hope. Crystal Simone Smith, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you so much for having me.
This year's theme for National Poetry Month is We Are All Meant for Something, an excerpt from the poem Carrying by U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limon. These poems, stories lead into the emotional experiences of mothers, the loss and suffering of the lives taken unjustly and too soon. How do poets interpret the world?
Oh, that is a very good question. You know, I think that we sort of look at the world through the lens of emotion sometimes, particularly as Black poets. It's sort of this challenge of sort of recognizing and representing trauma, um, and things that happen to us as a result of the climate and the world that we live in. And so I don't know, it's for me, it's just this art, this artistic production, and and it's just giving voice a lot of times to the events that are happening around us, and giving voice to the frustration of things that are
Mhm.
happening.
Your book, Dark Testament, embarks on an uncompromising exploration of collective mourning and really crafts a masterwork that resonates far beyond the pages. It lingers almost. It feels like it's lingering in your mind, in your body, in just your whole spirit, really. And you write as the mother of two Black sons. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about, you've referenced the tipping point. What is the tipping point, and what did you mean by that term?
So the tipping point, for me, it was a very low time. It was a low time for the nation. We were in the midst of, and this book has, I should say, has come out 3 years prior to when it was wrote. I mean, now that it's been 3 years since it was written, but that was a very dark time for the country. We were in the midst of the COVID shutdown. Uh, George Floyd was killed, and
Mhm.
we were all at home. And then all of a sudden, uh, everything had stopped, but racism obviously had not stopped,
Mhm.
and the killing of unarmed Black men. So that was very difficult for me, and it was also on the heels of Ahmaud Arbery, which is also
Mm.
difficult because my sons are distant runners, and they run through our neighborhoods and our streets, and alone often. And so that was a difficult time for me. So I feel like the tipping point, we were already at a very vulnerable state emotionally,
Mhm.
as a society, as a nation, and then for the racism that we know is ongoing,
Mhm.
um, and the violent acts and racial violence that is ongoing, just didn't cease. It just continued, even during this very prolific time in our history. And so that was a low point for me. And while I had time to write, because I was in a fellowship at that time, and of course we were all at home,
Mhm.
while I had time to write, it was difficult to to produce work. And so I found myself doing other things. And when I was reading this particular book, Lincoln and the Bardo, which is the
Mhm.
existing text that was used to create Dark Testament, um, Blackout poetry has often served as sort of a writing prompt
Mm.
for poets when we have writer's block. And so it wasn't really writer's block. I was just very low and frustrated and tired um, of the constant concern that I have to have as a mother. And those poems came out of all of that grief.
Mm. What worries you most about being a parent to Black sons? And I wonder what your conversations with your sons are like in this post whatever fill in the blank era, post blackout era.
Yeah, post blackout. That's a good one. We do have conversations with them. I think we all do. Anytime this comes up, we live in a world where children and teenagers constantly are engaging with media and social media,
Mhm.
and they see sometimes before I do the videos of killings and beatings of unarmed Black men, and they often bring it to me before I've seen it,
Mhm.
and it is frustrating for them. It's hard to have these conversations because I think what you want to do as a parent is you want to um, be able to, well, I won't say comfort. You want to be able to offer some sort of resolution, right? Or possible
Mm.
resolution, or what can be done. And we know in the political climate that we live in, um, that's a difficult thing to address. Not only for obviously for politicians, it seems difficult to address,
Mhm.
but with your own children as well. So even at my children are my oldest son is at driving age, and we have to have those conversations too about what you do when you're pulled over.
Mhm.
um, but for me as a poet, you know it's a little I have a little bit of distance from it because I do have a place where I can put it and I can
Yeah.
write about it, and I can, that is my sort of go-to in terms of dealing with some of the responses that I have to that. So I think it's a solace that I have that other Black mothers don't may not have.
Hmm. Dark Testament is really, as I mentioned earlier, as you know, well, really, forget me, but is a remarkable reckoning with our present moment. And it feels also like a call to action. Can we talk about George Saunders and why did you lean into this way of in terms of pulling together this project? Why did you lean into some of his work, some of his ideas?
Well, it's a long story, and I'll try to make it as brief as possible. I was writing about an enslaved woman named Elizabeth Keckley. So a lot of the courses that I teach and the research that I'm involved in has to do with enslaved people. And I was reading more about her to expound my knowledge on some of different takes on her, because I read her slave narrative, but he had included her briefly in this book. So any book that I could get my hands on that referenced Elizabeth Keckley, I wanted to read, and so this book was just next on the list. And it was a very experimental book, uh, not an easy read. Right? I call them roller coaster reads, right? Because it's just all over the place, and passages and characters, very character driven book. And what struck me most about it is that, of course, I go in with the notion that I'm going to be reading about Lincoln and his son dying, and Elizabeth Keckley was the enslaved person who lived or was in the White House when when Willie died. So I'm going into this whole story, this historical account of what happened to Lincoln. It is wrought with so much grief, and the characters are dead, and they're speaking from the grave, and in this bardo state where they're stuck between, life before and getting to the after, the hereafter. And so I'm in this moment, and I'm thinking, of course, there's protests happening on television, George Floyd, calling for the killers of George Floyd's, or I'm sorry, for the arrest of George Floyd's killers. And so all of this is happening, and the poems just started, the voices of the victims begin to sort of emerge out of these characters. And that was really the start of it. And I just wrote a couple poems at first. I blacked out a couple of poems, and I thought, this is sort of interesting. And it was sad. The content was sad. Obviously, you're mourning the dead. These poems, I like to tell people, these poems are not just blackout poems. They are elegies. They are poems for the dead. They're also poems. The victims are speaking from the grave. You know, there's this idea of what they might have said, and so yeah, that's really sort of how it came about. I wrote a couple of poems, and it intrigued me, and I began to sort of write more. And I realized the more of these poems that I wrote addressing more of the victims, because it sort of culminates, right? It's like this victim, and then there's another victim, and then there's another victim. And so I could just even go back into my mind all the way back to, um, Breonna Taylor, all the way back to there's so many I can't even. But I was just going back in Sandra Bland. I was going back and back, and so each passage sort of put me in the mindset of a particular victim, and that's really sort of how they came about. But I would say honestly, writing them uh, was almost like a relief from grief, to give them voice and to give them empower them in that way.
This is very curious to me. Did you ever hear their voices? Did they come to you in the spirit? How did you channel these words? Where did they come from?
So these characters, like I said, the characters themselves are speaking from the grave. They are dead. I think there's only two living characters in the book. Don't quote me on that, but I think there's only two. So they're speaking from the grave. So I think the circumstances in each of those certain passages, right? Um, and imagery. Poets, you know, we're very interested and intrigued by imagery, and so some of the scenes, the imagery, would be swaying trees,
Mm.
in the moonlight, and you could think about Trayvon Martin, you know, trying to make it home, um, that night, and then caught up in all of he got caught up in. So there are various, I should say, literary devices that decided which poem would be which poem.
I wonder if you could, this would be a nice pivot, if you could read for us the poem Black Witness on page 39 of the book.
Black Witness. From my left came a shout of terror, always bone chilling, fire sound. Who had gone? I could not tell, and was still too under siege myself to care.
What is this poem about?
So there's a poem before that poem called White Witness.
Yeah.
Um, I wanted to show or display the differences
Mm.
that we experience in those situations. So we know that there are white witnesses to these events, these horrific events. We know, dating back to Rodney King, that the gentleman who filmed his beating was a white gentleman
Mm.
on a porch, high up on a condo
Yeah.
on his balcony.
Yeah.
So it's such a different way of experiencing these things, and Black people, because it's here, because it's
Mm.
home, and it's very, very close often. Um, it is difficult. And
Mm.
so I think that poem, if I were to tell you what that poem really means to me, it's that I think we feel under siege, right? I think we all feel that way. And it crosses class lines, it crosses
Mm.
age, it crosses gender. We know, Sandra Bland and we know Breonna Taylor. It's not just unarmed black men. We tend to feel under siege.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the next generation of poets. I'm thinking about, one of the bigger names, the ones that we know, but the ones we don't know as well. But in this particular instance, Amanda Gorman, the youngest inaugural poet ever in the United States, she joins a very small group of poets who have been recruited and publicized. In particular for the presidential inauguration, the Hill We Climb, which was very well received. But I think my question is, what was the significance, you think, of us leaning into the hope and possibilities of poetry as a healing tool from a very young person and after the tumultuous events of January 6th?
Yes, yes, yes. So poetry has always been part of liberation movements and
Mm,
political change, and that dates back to Amiri Baraka. It dates back to many poets have been part of political change. That's not new. That itself is not new. I think the surge of poetry, because poetry historically we know is underread. Most people
yeah.
don't engage with poetry. This generation is different, and they're different because they have social media platforms. And these
Hmm.
platforms often, I think, if you could remember back to that time during the insurrection and George Floyd and all of that,
Hmm.
there was Twitter poetry, and there
Mm,
was blackout poetry. There were people creating blackout poems and posting them all over social media,
yeah.
and it became this sort of respite, really, during a
Mm,
very frustrating time. You could get this snapshot of a poem, and it could not only it's not only releasing frustrations, but it's helping, right? It's
yeah.
helping you cope, and so I think that the visual literacy really that this generation is experiencing is quite different from what we had, and
Mhm.
that in itself is going to be very interesting to watch. I think, but having said that, they're also I feel a little more open
Mm,
to change and to fighting for that change and you know voicing those opinions. We the generation that we're in, and I say we, you're probably in a younger generation than us.
I'm with you.
um the generation that we're in seems to be at this stalemate, really, and
Yeah,
it's very difficult to talk across lines.
yeah.
um and I don't really see that, even as an instructor, as a professor. I don't necessarily see that with younger people. There's far more of a tolerance
Yeah.
than we experienced.
I wonder if we could talk a little bit about what's going on in Florida. Florida's largest teachers union filed a lawsuit very recently against the state's Department of Education, in this first legal challenge of its kind over the law that really critics are saying is going to lead to more banned books in the states. And I think in light of what's going on with poetry and our effort even to support and lift up the voices of poets on the show, um, I wonder, is this helpful or hurtful for literature and poetry in particular?
I would say it makes the stakes much higher.
Yeah.
um, so yeah, we live in a current political environment that seems, at least part of that environment, seems eager to erase African American history and African American literature.
Hmm.
Um, it's problematic. I often tell my students that African American history is American history.
Hmm.
You can't have one without the other. Um, and so I think it makes the stakes higher. I think, like you said, it's really going to be important that poets of this generation continue to engage and continue to represent
Hmm.
that trauma and to recognize it and to put it into words. And I think it will. I think that that will continue. Um, it may even increase
Yeah.
because these efforts, and it's not really clear. I mean, we're not clear what woke is. I think it's a dog whistle word
Yeah. Yeah.
that says something about race, but and 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 otherness.
Yeah.
But but yeah, I mean, I think it's going to fuel. I mean, we much of what poets do uh, is that we write through those frustrations. So
Yeah.
it's fuel, really, in many ways. And I think the stakes are higher, and I think that people, it'll just, we're not going to stop.
Yeah. As a poet, when you look out at American society in 2023, what do you see?
Hmm.
Are you hopeful?
Um, I was telling someone a couple of days ago at a reading that so much of what I've written, I started writing poetry somewhere around 12, 14 years ago. And
Mhm.
so much of what I write today is so much darker
Mm.
than what I wrote when I started. I started really as a poet of memory, and I would think back to spending time, at my grandmother's home in the Blue Ridge Mountains. And if you're African American and you live in the city, I grew up in DC.
Yeah.
You always go back home. You travel back home for
Yeah.
in the
Yeah.
summertime to the South. And so much of my poetry was about that, eco poetry, really, and poetry that represented, goodness and you know, and so it's turned a lot darker, and that does concern me
Mhm.
because I feel like obviously we're a lot darker right now
Yeah.
as a nation, and I'm sure incrementally a historian can tell you where where that started and how it's continued.
Mhm.
Um, and we've obviously seen darker times. I teach the African American slave, the American slave narrative. We've obviously seen darker times, but it
Yeah.
doesn't seem like a an effort to reverse back to times that we've already felt like we've already resolved.
Yeah.
It seems like an effort to do that is really great, and so that in itself, I think there's something, as a poet, my
Yeah.
my job is not to legislate anything. My
Yeah.
job is simply to write and record what I see,
Yeah.
and I think there's something about progression, or the state of progression, or even the um, the speed of progression
Yeah.
that's bothering people. But progress is necessary, and
Yeah.
it's not going to stop because it's something that you disagree with.
Or
So,
feel uncomfortable. Yeah.
or makes you feel uncomfortable. Yes.
Right. Now, your book is dedicated to Cameron and Sydney and Black mothers and sons everywhere. And for that, as I was reading that, I couldn't help but think about Terrell Nichols, Trayvon Martin, Ahmaud Arbery, who you talked a little bit about, Michael Brown, and the mothers, and countless other young Black men and women who've been harmed or met death in a very violent way. Do you think we're desensitized to violence somehow? We're aware of this struggle most when we encounter violence, but I wonder if we've just grown desensitized over time.
I think we are as a nation. Um, it, it's it's becoming more of a problem. I think we're not just talking. I, my book's about race. My book is about Black Lives Matter and racial violence.
Yeah.
But we know, we understand that we have a terrible problem in this country with mass shootings, with guns and gun reform and
Yeah.
lack of gun reform. or the inability somehow to address any of it. And that's what seems to be the most problematic. These things happen and they happen on a regular basis. And
Mhm.
we just sort of deal with it in the moment and then we just move on and to the next event. And that does seem um, as though we are becoming far more desensitized to violence than we should be. And I'm
Mhm.
not sure what the tipping point for that is. You know, I look back, there are many instances in time when you look
Mhm.
at Rodney King and his beating happened, one of the first recorded acts of police violence that happened, you know, over 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And then you speed up to Sandy Hook, where there was no response
Yeah.
legislation. And these are, you know, children, 5 and 6 year old children. I tell you, I've been a parent volunteer in classrooms with 5 and 6 year old children. They're the most innocent among us.
Yeah.
If no one is responding to that and the continuation, it just, you know, at some point, I don't know where that's going to lead.
Yeah.
Um, but it's not good. And continuing to ignore it is not good either. So police interactions and police brutality, you know, that's a subsection of what we are dealing with in terms of violence in this nation.
Mhm. This year's theme for National Poetry Month is "We Are All Meant for Something." An excerpt from the poem "Carrying" by, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, U.S. Poet Laureate Ada Limon. What are we carrying? And what should advocacy and activism look like in the 21st century?
Hmm. Um, I think we have a responsibility to voice uh, our frustration. Absolutely, it's a responsibility, and for me, at least for me, it is.
Mhm.
Um, we are carrying a lot. We're constantly engaged in negative information, in misinformation, in many cases, and it does, I think, take a toll,
Mm,
and that toll we often just sort of bury away and just sort of, you know, continue in the cycle, because what it is a cycle. It's just
yeah.
you wake up the next day, it's every day you're just going through it. um, so we are carrying a lot. um, you know, I don't know, I can't speak for everybody, so I don't know how we should proceed. But I think that Black Lives Matter, the sort of protesting that we do is not so much, you know, about we're angry, we have to hit the streets, we have to make sure justice is served. It's really about, in many ways, survivor's guilt, right? Like
Mhm.
it could have been you. It could have been
Yeah.
your brother, your husband, your partner,
Mhm.
right? So we have the survivor's guilt. And it's also about just making sure that human life is worthy, right?
Yeah.
It's worthy. It's worthy of safety and protection. It's worthy of justice when an injustice happens. And so it's much more it's not so much about, although there is frustration and anger, it's far
Yeah.
bigger than that. So that is our responsibility, I think, is to keep towing the line, you know, and the more, as you said, desensitized we become,
Yeah.
um, that should be the catalyst, right? That should be the thing that says, if I'm feeling like this is not important, then I better
Yeah.
I better really, you
Yeah.
know, respond now.
Yeah. Crystal Simone Smith is a poet, indie publisher, and educator. Her most recent book is a collection of poems, Dark Testament, is now available where books are sold. Thank you so much for joining us this week.
Thanks so much for having me.
And that's it for our program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram or Twitter. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.